A very warm welcome to all our viewers from across the world. Today we have with us Mr. Alexander Gray, who of course needs no introduction, but I have very painstakingly tried to shorten his bio so that we don't take up much time. So I'll just begin with that. Mr. Alexander Gray is a co-founder and managing partner at American Global Strategies LLC. He's most recently served as the Deputy Assistant to the President and Chief of Staff of the White House National Security Council, where he was responsible for the National Security Advisor's front office and the budget, personnel, and security functions of the NSC. Previously, he served in the White House as Special Assistant to the President for the Defense Industrial Base at the National Economic Council, the Principal Executive Office of the President, official responsible for matters impacting the defense and manufacturing industrial base, and as Director for Oceania and Indo-Pacific Security at the NSC. Mr. Gray is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council and a visiting fellow at the Lexington Institute. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, National Review, the Weekly Standard, Naval War College Review, Strategic Studies Quarterly, and the Proceedings of the U.S. Naval Institute. He's currently writing a book on the U.S. strategy in the Pacific Islands. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. It's an absolute honor to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Right. So I'll begin right away with the questions. So, sir, of course, you've played a very decisive role in shaping the U.S. economic and security policy for Asia under the Trump administration. So, looking back, what would you say were the strengths and the weaknesses of the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific policy?
Well, thanks for the question. I think the most important change that happened in the Trump administration on Indo-Pacific policy, and what will probably be the legacy of the administration that's going to last over many, many decades, is the clarity with which, from the president on down, the administration spoke about the challenge of China and the extent to which the administration made China the organizing principle of our national security strategy. So the way we did that was through strategic documents. You look at the National Security Strategy of 2017, you look at the National Defense Strategy, you look at the Indo-Pacific Strategic Framework that was declassified at the end of the administration. And what all those have in common is they acknowledge that great power competition is going to be the foremost challenge facing the United States in the decades ahead. So I think the best way to explain that in more operational terms is when I came into the White House on January 20th, 2017, the main focus of the US government was not competition with China. It was any number of different areas that different agencies were focused on. There was no holistic strategy. It was very disparate. The day I left the White House, January 20th, 2021, every agency of the United States government was focused on the challenge of China. That was every agency, as from the Defense Department to the State Department to the Commerce Department to the Treasury Department to the agencies that handle pension funds for U.S. retirees, the Labor Department. We really had an entire whole of government approach to the challenge posed by China. And I think that is that's going to be the legacy of the Trump administration. The area in which I think we could have done some things differently was messaging. There's a lot of discussion about President Trump's how he spoke about our allies and our partners, some of his tweets, some of his personal concerns about burden sharing and different ways our allies interacted with us. What was lost in that discussion was the extent to which the U.S. actually strengthened our Indo-Pacific alliances and partnerships to an unprecedented level. And you could see that on a bilateral basis with the U.S.-India strategic partnership, which has been a bipartisan success story of the last 20 years. You could see it with the Quad, with India, Japan, and Australia. You could see it with the strengthening of the U.S.-Japan partnership, which has reached all-time highs of cooperation and collaboration. The U.S.-Taiwan partnership has never been stronger. So the U.S.-Vietnam relationship continues to grow by leaps and bounds. We just saw Secretary Austin in Hanoi last couple of days, continuing to build on the success that the Trump administration had and that relationship. So I think what we should have been more proactive about was explaining to the American people, but also to the people of the Indo-Pacific, just how committed we were to those important relationships. And unfortunately, in all the kind of media, excitement over tweets and comments, it was lost just how dedicated the administration was to our alliances and our partnerships. And I think that was something we definitely could have improved on.
Thank you so much for that question, and I'll take forward the points which you raised, and I'm glad you brought out China, because there's of course a lot of discussion going on around that now, especially U.S.-China relations. So according to you, do you see a policy continuity with the current Biden administration, specifically when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region?
I think there's a great deal of continuity. I've been very gratified by how much of the approach that President Trump took to China policy has been continued by President Biden. And the best way to judge that empirically is if you look at the Biden administration's interim national security strategic guidance, which came out a couple of months into their administration while they're still writing their formal national security strategy. And the interim guidance, when you put it up next to the Trump national security strategy, there are superficial differences on things like climate change and diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what you see when you look past the superficial differences, you see a fundamental agreement on the challenge posed by China, and that has been manifested in a couple of ways. On the economic side, we've seen the Biden administration continue a lot of what we termed economic security focus of the Trump administration. So there's been a continual effort to strengthen American domestic manufacturing and American domestic industry to prepare to prepare ourselves to compete with China through things like Buy America program and other aspects of economic security. So that's been continued and in some cases even strengthened under the Biden administration. You look at Taiwan policy, we've seen even greater emphasis, maybe perhaps not even greater, but a significant interest and significant expansion of the relationship with Taiwan. And we've seen very high-profile moves like supporting some military aircraft landing in Taipei. We've seen some high-profile delegations, some senior U.S. senators visiting Taipei. We've seen the easing of some restrictions on U.S. engagement with Taiwan. It's all been very positive. The Quad, they've put a tremendous emphasis on the importance of the Quad, and indeed, it was one of the, if not the first, one of the first head of state meetings that President Biden did when he assumed office was with the Quad leaders. So there's been a really positive continuity there. I will say one area in which I do have some concerns is on the defense spending side, and the Chinese are very focused, as are our allies and partners in the region, on U.S. defense spending as a metric of our capacity and our willingness to stay in the Indo-Pacific long term and to deter potential acts of destabilization and aggression. And when we watch the defense budget stay stagnant or with rising inflation actually in real terms go down, it sends a very negative signal both to the Chinese and to the region about American staying power and American commitment. So I do have real concerns there. And particularly as the administration is continuing so many of the positive policies of its predecessor, it's even more important to have a fully resourced military capability so that those commitments and promises aren't hollow.
Thank you so much. My next question again concerns China, and I want to know your views on how you view the PLA's military modernization efforts, which undoubtedly has been ramped up in recent times, along with its military aggressiveness. specifically in terms of its naval modernization efforts. So, do you see Chinese expansion of its naval capabilities as a threat to what has been a predominant role for the US in the region, the US Navy?
So I would go even farther than that. I went back, and the first time I wrote about this issue was in 2010. And in 2010, there was a debate about whether the PLA Navy was going to focus itself, uh, whether it even had ambitions to be a regional power. So if we think about that, a little over 11 years ago, there was actually serious policy and scholarly discussion about whether the PLA even wanted to dominate the seas around China. Well, now, a decade later, we know certainly they have that ambition. They've invested in the capabilities to do that many times over, to deny access to the US and its allies and partners, to intervene in a variety of scenarios in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. So they certainly have that ambition. But what's changed in those intervening 10, 11 years is the debate is no longer about whether China has ambitions in its regional waters. China has shown now its ambitions globally on the maritime sphere. We've seen a base in Djibouti in the Middle East. We've seen serious discussions about bases on the Atlantic coast of Africa. We've seen ambitions for naval bases in the Indian Ocean, naval bases in the Pacific Islands. We've seen Chinese ships regularly enter the Mediterranean for joint exercises with Russia. We've seen port agreements through One Belt, One Road as far as Greece and the Balkans. Those are dual use agreements that can very quickly go from economic to having a military component. So the ambitions of the PLA and the PLAN are no longer debatable about whether these are regional ambitions. These are global ambitions. And the concern that many of us who served in government have are the Chinese Navy is not just growing at a quantity. It's not just a quantitative increase, it's qualitative as well. So that they're expanding their capabilities, they're growing their proficiency in key skills like at-sea replenishment and maritime logistics. They're learning how to do flight operations on their carriers, all the important skills that are needed to have a blue water expeditionary navy. But they're also growing the size of the PLAN at a rapid clip. Even at one point in the last month or so, commissioning 3 new ships in a single day. The U.S. Navy, of course, has fallen to about 290 ships at the height of the Cold War in 1987. The U.S. Navy had a little under 600 ships, and we're down to about 290. And the argument has always been, for those who are not as concerned about a shrinking U.S. Navy, that quality has a quantity all of its own. I would strongly disagree with that view. And the U.S. Navy, along with its allies and partners, with India, with Japan, with Australia, at a certain point, it becomes very dangerous to have fallen so far below the number of ships of our primary competitor, who's not just continuing to grow their fleet, but is investing in very real anti-access area denial capabilities with the explicit goal of denying the U.S. and its partners the ability to operate freely right now in the seas near China. But I think, judging by the behavior that I just outlined, that scope is growing much more globally.
So I'm glad that you brought up the question of partnership. And of course, when you talk about India, Japan, and Australia, the first thing that comes to our mind is Quad. So do you think that together Quad's naval capabilities will be enough to deter an aggressive China in the region?
So the Quad is an interesting mechanism. I think that we're still trying to figure out between the 4 partner countries is what shape will the Quad take. You know, I've heard the phrase Pacific NATO used quite a bit. Of course, that implies a number of things that have yet to be really codified. For one, there's a treaty, and there are legal obligations imposed on the members of NATO. There's a headquarters structure. There's Article 5 that requires mutual self-defense. So there are all sorts of very specific and binding obligations on NATO members that I don't think politically anyone has made a decision in Delhi or in Tokyo or Canberra or Washington that they want to accept all of the obligations that would go along with that kind of security architecture. I think what is at this point in time makes the most sense for a Quad construct is a construct where the leaders of the four like-minded democracies, major democracies of the Indo-Pacific, speak with one voice on political and diplomatic matters impacting the four countries and impacting the region. And I think one of the things we learned in the Trump administration was just how much synergy and agreement there is on big binding matters in the Indo-Pacific. So, things like freedom of navigation, things like freedom from economic coercion, response to pandemics, the really big picture kind of liberal democratic order, international order issues where there's not much dissonance between the four countries. I'd like to see the Quad continue to be a mechanism for speaking as one united front on those issues. I think where the Quad is there's going to be some question about the best way to use it will be on the military side. I think what we have to be very wary of is the Quad becoming seen either by China or by the countries of the region as a device for containment of China. I think that poses some significant challenges for our statecraft if the Quad is seen in that way, rather than upholding a set of universal values. I also would like to see the Quad used in two additional ways. One, as a nucleus of a group of additional countries, a Quad plus construct where additional countries can join the Quad on various issues. I'd like to see Taiwan as part of that. I'd like to see Southeast Asia. I'd like to see some of the Pacific Islands be able to join with the Quad to join, raise their voices on important, particularly issues of broader freedom of navigation and things that affect the entire region. The other way in which I think the Quad could be very helpful is on the issue of economic coercion. We've seen the Chinese use economic coercion against countries like Australia. We've seen them use it against the Philippines, Taiwan, even Norway. After a Nobel Prize was awarded to someone, a Chinese dissident, they cut off the import of Norwegian salmon. And they've cut off Taiwanese pineapples and Philippine bananas, Australian wine. And what I'd like to see, one mechanism that would be very useful is for the Quad to be a linchpin of response. So when the Chinese attempt to boycott or cut off, economically coerce a country in the region over some political issue where there's disagreement, the Quad can be a very powerful source to come in and say, we won't allow that type of economic coercion. We'll make up for whatever the economic loss the Chinese are imposing on that country. We'll buy your lamb, or we'll buy your beef. We'll pick up that slack and prevent you from falling under that economic coercion. So I think there's a lot the Quad can do to be responsive and reactive to real world situations without becoming a Pacific NATO.
Right. Thank you so much. And I completely agree with your view in terms of Quad. And I do believe that projections of Quad as an Asian NATO is motivated, politically motivated, to say the least. So this brings me to my next question, and I would love to hear your views on how you view India-US naval bonhomie shaping up within this construct of Quad.
So I think the U.S.-India relationship is one of the great success stories of the last 20 years. And if you watch it from the George W. Bush administration to the Biden administration, it's really been just a successive upward trajectory and a bipartisan in the United States success story. And we've heard all the statistics. The world's largest democracy and the world's oldest democracy. So much, the human interplay between Indian Americans who brought so much vibrancy to the United States, and so many cultural linkages between the two countries. We look at the growing military cooperation, particularly in the naval realm, the Malabar exercises that have become so important. We look at the ability of India to play a major role in upholding the international order in the Indian Ocean. We look at India's ability to be a force multiplier for those goals throughout the Indian Ocean basin. So there's so much positive synergy between the two countries that I think that relationship has just almost an unlimited upward trajectory, and there's no ceiling on how positive that relationship could go. I think that, I said this when I was in office, the Chinese made probably their greatest geopolitical blunder of the last 100 years by choosing to behave the way they did towards India along the line of actual control last year. And I think the decision that was made to undertake that aggression and the murder of Indian soldiers along the line of actual control, I think what that did was it reminded, it seemed to, from an outside perspective, it seemed to remind the Indian public of some of the long-standing challenges that China's posed to Indian security. And it also, I think, showed the Indian political leadership and the Indian public that the United States can offer a very positive security partnership on different issues. And I think it also reminded the United States that India can be an incredibly useful partner in confronting Chinese aggression across the region. So I think the galvanizing effect of that horrible, tragic incident is going to have a lot of lasting repercussions for the U.S.-India relationship. Obviously, very, very tragic for everyone involved. But I think coming out of that and watching India's response, particularly on the decision to ban some of the Chinese social media apps and some of the responses there, that actually also served as a important example to the United States of some of the economic tools that are available to address Chinese malign activity. And so, I think the relationship in the context both of China and bilaterally, I think the relationship has a lot of positive momentum and is really just kind of unlimited in how much closer the ties between Delhi and Washington can get.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gray. And now, of course, you've been talking about Taiwan a lot, and I would like to take the conversation forward to Taiwan now. So we've obviously seen in recent times that how China has been repeatedly made several incursions into Taiwan's airspace and has also been ramping up its military pressure, which has, of course, raised apprehensions that China is inching closer to using violence to resolve this unification problem. My question would be that how do you think this affects U.S. relations with Taiwan vis-a-vis China?
Well, any coercive activity against Taiwan is going to have a major impact, not just on U.S.-Taiwan relations, but I think it's going to have in U.S.-China relations, but a major impact on China's global standing. And the premise that China is a responsible global stakeholder, I think, has already failed to stand up to the scrutiny of its own behavior, whether it's the issue in the line of actual control that we discussed, whether it's the economic coercion, the intellectual property theft, behavior in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. I think the last 10 years has shown that China is not a responsible global stakeholder. But I think that any coercive action against Taiwan would completely and for all times end that pretense. There would be no more ability for China to act as if it has any claim to leadership on the global stage. I think that if you look at most recent statements coming from Japan and coming from Australia, there's a growing realization in the region, even among countries that do not have particularly long-standing. They don't have the same type of security ties that the U.S. has to Taiwan, but they are beginning to understand and speak publicly about the challenge that would impact the entire region if coercion was used against Taiwan. And I say coercion rather than aggression, because economic coercion and economic blockade, there are any number of ways in which China can exercise significant power against Taiwan to negative effect. And we've already seen the very sophisticated campaign that Beijing has launched to flip the remaining diplomatic allies of Taiwan in the Pacific, in Africa, in the Western Hemisphere. And I think that's important. The diplomatic component of this coercion is important for us to think about as well. Not to mention the economic side that I alluded to. A small example was China's decision to boycott pineapple imports from Taiwan, which had a very significant economic impact. You can extrapolate that across the full range of economic relations between the two countries, and there could be significant levers that China could use in that relationship that would have a very profound impact on how the world views China and on how the United States views China. So I think that going forward, the United States and its partners and its allies, particularly Australia and Japan, who've spoken out about this in public, I think we've got to be increasingly vigilant about how to strengthen Taiwan's both its self-defense capability, which we've been doing energetically for the last several years, and hopefully will continue under President Biden. But also, how do we strengthen Taiwan's economic capacity and political capacity to harden itself against Chinese coercion and malign activity? It's not just the military aspect, as I said. So I'd like to see, going back to the Quad, one way in which I think the Quad could be very useful is to serve as a mechanism for providing an alternative if a country like Taiwan faces boycotts from China, faces economic stress. I'd like to see the Quad as a way to step up and provide an alternate source, economic market and destination for something like the Taiwanese pineapples. I'd like to see that as an option, and I think that's a way in which the U.S. and its partners can be very constructive in mitigating some of the challenges China's posing to Taiwan right now.
Right. Thank you so much.